I very much am honored and humbled to be here. I hope I'm not going to speak too long. I will not bore you to death by PowerPoint because my PowerPoint is sitting in the trunk of my car and it was too cold to go back and get it. So I'm going to try this. There's some lovely pictures if you want to throw them back up, but if not, you'll have to deal with these pictures and we'll go forward. So I was asked by Doug if I could spend a little time talking about homeless youth and trauma through the eyes of homelessness and through the eyes of youth. And, excuse me, I've been involved in looking at homeless issues for quite a number of years, but it wasn't until about, I'd say, a year and a half or two ago, when I was deeply involved in beginning to write out more of the details of working with a variety of different people, that I became acutely aware of the extent to which trauma is a factor that plays into the lives of those who have experienced any kind of housing instability or homelessness. What made it even more acute was the fact that for homeless youth, almost all homeless youth will either experience trauma before becoming homeless or after becoming homeless. There was a study that was done out in Fredericton that looked in great depth at the lives of homeless youth, both before and after losing housing. And when we're talking about trauma, we're talking about something very specific. I'm not talking about a bad experience. I'm talking about the kind of life experiences that really place an individual at risk, at fear for their life, for their personal integrity, whether that is physical integrity or psychological integrity. I'm talking about those kinds of experiences where someone has witnessed someone either dying suddenly, being subject to some kind of severe accident, or they're personally involved in an accident. I'm talking about trauma as being the victim of continual and severe physical, mental, or sexual abuse. I'm talking about trauma that is perpetrated by one human being to another, for the most part. We all know of traumatic events that occur when they're acts of nature, but the traumatic events that occur when they're wrought at the hands of another human being are particularly difficult. And when they're experienced by a young individual, not only does it leave that individual with profound, long-lasting scars, emotional scars, we also know from some pioneering work that was done by a neuropsychiatrist by the name of Bruce Perry down in Texas. And he spent some time up here in child psychiatry with Alberta Health Services. But we know from Dr. Perry's work that traumatic events can impact the developmental process inside the forming brain. And if we think that, if we remember that our brains are not totally formed until age 24 or 25, then we can again appreciate the fact that any kind of traumatic experience that a child has is going to impact them. So what does it mean to be impacted by trauma? It means to experience feelings of fear, of anxiety, of helplessness, of hopelessness, of depression, of powerlessness. And so a young adult, as that young adolescent, young adult, tries to struggle with developing relationships, both within the family and outside of the family. When those family relationships, again, may be impacted through all kinds of negative experiences, which we can label traumatic. We wind up with a young adult who then seeks outside of the family to find some other ways of coping. So homeless youth come, many of them with traumatic experiences. We know that for many young males, those traumatic experiences can be more of a physical nature, although they can also be of a sexual nature. For females, often the excuse has been in terms of sexual exploitation. And if they didn't have those experiences before they hit the streets, They certainly have them afterwards. So what does all of that mean in terms of trying to help these young individuals as they seek to try to find some kind of life? As we have to try to remember that these individuals are part of our future. They're part of a growing generation, and if we don't help this generation to begin to grow and develop in positive ways, they are going to be left at the margins of society, unfortunately, along with other people who find themselves marginalized and have difficulty getting out of that particular trap. And so too often we've thought of homeless youth as angry, rebellious, unwilling to adhere to the rules of society. But what if we put on a trauma lens? What, instead of looking at this behavior as just being an angry youth, we look at it as an understandable, predictable, natural, normal reaction to the kind of horrific experiences that a lot of these young folks have faced. I'm not talking about 100% everyone who's homeless, but I'm certainly talking about the vast majority of homeless youth. So if we look through a trauma lens, I think that we then begin to see that there are different ways that we can help approach these youth. That we can see that their behavior is the understandable coping mechanisms that have been used to try to survive very difficult and unusual circumstances. That we have to then, in our outreach efforts and our efforts to try to help these youth, to develop approaches that look at how we can best help to provide them with a sense of safety, to understand that trust will be something that comes very slowly and over a period of time. It's not overnight. That it may take several different attempts by several different individuals or adults before that particular youth can form a meaningful and trusting relationship. It doesn't mean that each person along the way has failed, but each person along the way may be a stepping stone to ultimately helping that individual to form relationships from which they can move forward. It means, so that's what it means on a personal level. I know that Alina and Stasha are going to talk more about what happens on a systems level, because I think that this is part of the issue and not the total issue. But we have to start by looking at these kids as kids who are in need. I'm reminded of, didn't used to think of them as homeless. It was just a friend that my 16-year-old daughter brought through the door one day and said, "Mom, this is Jamie and he needs a place to stay." And Jamie stayed with us for about 6 months. Jamie ultimately moved on. I thought at the time that it was a failure on my part that I hadn't been able to provide enough of a stable home that he would stay in. But I came to recognize over time that Jamie needed to make several different attempts at stability before he found the right one that would work for him. He was a child who had been brought up in a single-parent home. His mother had died when he was at a young age from cancer. His subsequent caregivers were his elder siblings who had their own emotional difficulties and couldn't look after him. He had been abused physically and sexually by mother's boyfriends before she died. So he had had a whole legacy of instability, insecurity, and traumatic experiences. I hope at this point Jamie, who would be an adult in his 30s, has settled down to a more stable lifestyle. But Jamie has a humanity about him. And I think for me, he represents a part of what the homeless youth is all about, someone who needs to have a caring place, and at the same time to have individuals who recognize that the struggle that he or anyone in his situation has are very deep struggles. And they're not just struggles with being, quote, badass kids, and they're not just struggles with being substance abusers. Yeah, Jamie's a little pot on the side, but as far as I'm concerned, excuse me, everybody, no big deal compared to everything he could have been involved in. There could have been an awful lot worse. So we have to put some kind of perspectives on this. So that is my message in terms of working with homeless youth, is remembering that so many of them have come through so many traumatic experiences that we have to look through a traumatic lens as how we can begin to help these youth to pull their lives together.